everyone. Welcome to this new episode of the Explicitly Pro-Life podcast. I'm Kristan Hawkins. Thanks for tuning in. All right, so we are going to have another special episode today. As you all know, we're stuck in quarantine still because of the coronavirus, trying to protect the most vulnerable amongst us. And by the way, you should be paying attention to all of the CDC guidelines. As a mom of 2 children with cystic fibrosis, I find it very important that we all stick through this, even though we know this is a very hard time for many of us right now, and many of us are hurting. So I wanted to bring to you, we're doing a series right now at Students for Life online every Thursday. I've got a different pro-life leader on. We're kind of talking about ways you can be involved in the pro-life movement, even right now, and then after quarantines end. And because, as you know, Planned Parenthood and the abortion industry certainly aren't stopping, and we cannot let our momentum go. We can't lose the momentum we have, because we are so close to achieving kind of phase 1 of our mission, which is getting Roe and Doe reversed, setting the decision of abortion back to the states. So I wanted to kind of bring to you another one of these discussions I just had online with Jay Watts. He is the founder of Merely Human Ministries. He worked for many years under Scott Klusendorf at Life Training Institute. He's a wonderful pro-life apologist. He trains a lot of our Students for Life leaders, even our staff members and team members across the country. And I think this is a discussion you're going to want to hear. And I think it's so good you won't mind the poor audio quality, because this was recorded online, because there's a lot of takeaways. I was actually taking several notes during our conversation. So the conversation starts with me kind of asking Jay how we can have more effective conversation and dialogue with those who disagree with us online, which we all know. There's a lot of keyboard courage that comes out, and sometimes not the best of humanity comes out, especially on Twitter. Don't get me started on my tweets. Oh my gosh, people send me the most horrible tweets. I cannot believe it. But I think this is a big thing. At Students for Life, we've been talking about how do we continue our work and on our mission, because we're not on campuses. So we actually launched a new website called askaprolifer.com, and any person, and we're running ads right now, not to pro-lifers, to pro-abortion people. We have 2 team members standing by 15 hours a day who will answer any question that comes on this website via chat or text message or email. And so there's a way you can kind of start having discussions. And if you get into a pickle, you can encourage people, hey, may not know the best answer, or I got to run. Can you send that question over to askaprolifer.com? And you kind of outsource your responsibility there. But I want you to know how to have conversations and feel empowered to have conversations. So check out this and stay listening to kind of hear Jay talk about how the best way to have conversations, how to get common ground with people. Because that's really what a lot of times when we know this on campuses, especially when we're having conversations, we need to diffuse the situation. I'll also ask Jay some of the kind of toughest questions and some of the most outlandish questions I've been hearing. There's one question about an alien. Are pro-lifers pro-aliens if aliens would come down to earth? I also ask about bodily autonomy, privacy rights. You often hear those. I ask him about why he should have an opinion about abortion, because he's a man. We talk about suffering. And I also actually end the podcast asking him a little bit about his personal conversion story. He was an atheist, was pro-choice, became a Christian, and then became pro-life. And how do we have conversations with not only pro-choice people, but atheists, because that is something. And if you listen to my earlier podcast with Teresa from San Francisco Pro-Life, this is a question I often face of when you're trying to talk to somebody who has such a radically different worldview than you. How do you talk to them about abortion? So this is definitely a podcast and discussion you're going to want to listen into, and you might want to take notes. Jay talks about a lot of books that we all need to be reading. We probably should have had a coronavirus quarantine book reading club, to be honest with you. So keep listening. I know you're going to love this podcast, and I will see you all next week on Explicitly Pro-Life. Don't forget to subscribe, tell your friends to subscribe, and leave a review. Thanks, guys. Hey everyone, it's Kristan Hawkins, and welcome to this pro-life training under quarantine week 2 event. We have a very special guest with us on tonight, Jay Watts, the founder of Merely Human Ministries. He's a brilliant pro-life apologist. And our topic tonight is going to be about how we can change minds online. But before we get to that, I want to kind of go over some things that are happening right now. First, I want to thank lifenews.com. They've been partnering with us for the series. As you all know, this is 5 weeks, every Thursday at 8 o'clock Eastern. I'll be here with a special guest, with a friend, a leader in the pro-life movement. We're going to be educating you all on a different aspect of pro-life activism and how you can be active right now. Even while we're at home under quarantine, and how you can get active saving lives. We've got a lot going on in the pro-life movement. As you all know, we've thankfully have 11 states now that have blocked abortion, have said that abortion is a non-essential service. States like Ohio, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, Iowa, Indiana, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Tennessee. If I missed one, I'm sorry. These state governors have been very courageous and saying very honestly that abortion is never medically necessary. It's certainly not an essential service right now. We should all be at home helping to slow the spread. That's something that the president, the vice president have been speaking about daily, how it's all up to us to protect the vulnerable. Unfortunately, the abortion industry disagrees that abortion is unnecessary. So they've been suing states to remain active and open in Texas and Iowa and Mississippi. So we'll see how these lawsuits go. We've already seen some victories from these lawsuits, but I do expect the abortion industry, led by Planned Parenthood, not to give up, because we know what they're all about, and that is abortion, abortion, abortion. I think right now, during this tragedy of coronavirus, this crisis that we're all in, it's sadly a perfect example of just how much the abortion industry, how much Planned Parenthood is really all about abortion. In my state of Pennsylvania, for example, they've shut down all services that Planned Parenthood provides, minus abortions, and they're only committing abortions. So I know, because we're home, it can feel like our work, our pro-life mission just has to stop, that it just ceases. But we know it doesn't stop. We know every single day women find themselves in an unplanned crisis situation. We know all the time that there's conversations that go on about abortion. And we know every time there's a conversation about abortion, we have an opportunity to plant a seed in someone's mind with the truth or change their minds. We had a beautiful example of this just today, where we got a prayer request that came in. We found out that a young woman was considering abortion after her child was diagnosed with Down syndrome in the womb, was considering a late-term abortion. And then today, less than 24 hours later, because of a pro-life activist, because of someone who, just like us, a member of the pro-life generation, who knows the truth and is unafraid to share that truth, because of that person, that mother has chosen life, and she will give birth to her beautiful child. So our pro-life activism, even though we're at home, is not stopping. At Students for Life, as you know, if you've been following our blog or our Facebook posts, we have a ton going on right now. We have a 5-week virtual course. You can go to studentsforlife.org/virtual and sign up. All 20 of our regional coordinators are giving a 1 week, every week, a different training. So it's a 5-week training. This week is week 2. And this is also why we're doing this Facebook Live training every Thursday. So you're kind of getting a glimpse if you don't sign up for the full course. If you know of a pro-life person who has questions about abortion, or a pro-choice friend, we've created a new website, Ask a Pro-Lifer. Go to studentsforlife.org/abortion-question. For 15 hours a day, there are Students for Life team members who are manning that website via text, via chat, via email. You can submit any question you have about abortion, how abortions are done, about field development. This is a great website resource to give to pro-choice friends, or friends of yours who are just kind of trying to figure out how they feel about abortion. This is a safe space for them to go to. They can ask any question. So make sure you promote studentsforlife.org/abortion-question. If you're a pro-life student or a community activist, make sure you sign up at Students for Life HQ, studentsforlifehq.com. That's our free online training portal. So all the trainings we give in person are also online, and they're free. Also, talk. So this is really why I asked Jay to come on tonight. So Students for Life, we have sort of an ambitious goal this year. We've challenged the pro-life generation to have 250,000 conversations this school year about abortion. 250,000 conversations about abortion. But we just can't do it ourselves. We need your help. That's why we launched Talk About Life 250K. I'm not a very creative person, as you can tell. So the Talk initiative is really cool because you can actually go to talk.studentsforlifehq.com and you can pledge to have conversations about abortion. Then you can come back and log your conversations. Tell us how your conversations went. For every 50 conversations that you tell us that you've had about abortion, you will earn a $10 Amazon gift card, which that is the currency du jour. That's how I'm doing all of my shopping and feeding my family right now. And we trust you. You're pro-life. We trust you not to lie to us. But all you have to do is have 50 conversations. So a lot of folks have been asking, well, how do I have conversations for Talk if I'm not on campus or if I'm not in my community? Well, we have the solution, and that is why my special guest, Jay Watts, is with us tonight. Jay is going to teach us how to have conversations online, how we can respond to hard questions we may get in a chat room, a Reddit chat room, or if we post maybe a graphic on our Facebook page and we get our pro-choice family and friends to comment, how you can have conversations and how you can respond to questions you might get or those like snarky comments you may get, so you can hopefully move that person in your life closer to the truth. If you go to talk.studentsforlifehq.com, we actually have some videos that you can watch. It'll teach you how a conversation online can be considered a conversation. And really, to be honest with you, it's pretty simple. It's just back and forth. It's not being snarky. It's not being mean. It's when someone says, oh, I hate President Trump because of this and he's pro-choice. And you say, really? Why would you feel that way? I agree with this, this, and this. And you actually have a conversation. It's not yelling back and forth or mean words. It's an actual conversation. And that will count towards Talk. So I want to introduce Jay. Jay is the founder and president of Merely Human Ministries. Jay has trained Students for Life leaders, all of our Wilberforce, Stevens, and Christian Leadership Fellows. He's always a good sport. We fly him all across the country and don't give him a lot of money to come and present to train all of us. He's spoken to many of you at the National Students for Life Conference or the ProLife Summit. So Jay is an expert, and I think he's a great person to really be following on social media and what he's doing in Really Human Ministries, because what I love what he's doing is not only Jay will kind of dissect those hard questions you get, but he does it in a winsome and fun way. So Jay, welcome on to the Facebook Live tonight.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So I'm glad I haven't got to see you a while in person. And I guess it's the closest we're going to get. So thanks for getting on. And we're doing this like pro-life training under quarantine. And we were thinking, how can we teach grassroots pro-lifers how to have effective conversations online? And you were the top person that came to our mind. And I know we get some of these hard questions sometimes about, would a child be better off not to be aborted? Or what if the mother's living in poverty? Or isn't abortion safer than childbirth? So I thought maybe you stuff to you tonight. Tell us how to answer some of these hard questions.
Absolutely great. First, let's just talk about the line. Whenever we move from private conversations or personal conversations that are face-to-face, and people behave better face-to-face.
They do.
I mean, they are so much better behaved. It's funny because people will ask me all the time, isn't it hard on college campuses? I tell them, much less hard than online stuff, right? I mean, when they have to look me in the eye, they behave more like a human being. Mm-hmm. So we have to recognize the limitations of the medium or even what is working against us here. And the medium itself can be, it doesn't have to be, but it can be a little dehumanizing. So I think as we go into just a basic way to dialogue with people, we have to get comfortable with the idea of how do we ask questions that will help them feel comfortable initially and also establish some common ground. I think Greg Kokel in his book Tactics talks about a great way to start. One of the questions he asked is he asked people as he enters in dialogue, do you consider yourself a tolerant person? Do you consider yourself a reasonable person? Do you consider yourself somebody that's willing to think about things, a thoughtful person? So those questions help to set the table for the discussion. And those are questions that we can do and digitally or in this kind of format as well. Also, I ask questions in addition to those, where I'll ask questions like, would it be wrong for you and I to kill each other? Let's start there. Would that be wrong if you and I killed each other? Because if they say yes, and I say objectively wrong, let's clarify. Would it be wrong in all places, at all times, no matter what country we live in, for somebody to unjustly take the life of another human being? If they say yes, then I know we've got tons of common ground right from the beginning, right? We both believe in objective morality. So now we have to center the conversation on a point where we can get to the nitty gritty of it, right? What is the dividing point between the two of us? If you think it's wrong to kill human beings, why not them? What it is about them that we're allowed to kill them, but we should not kill each other? What is the difference between them and us? And for that, one of the things I want to say, as far as somebody who watches online discussions a lot, I tell people, I'll be your Facebook friend. I won't get into your Facebook fights for you. Don't tag me, because I'm not going to come in and bail you out once you start arguing with people. But I will watch you a lot, because I love to see how you argue. And one of the things I noticed that pro-lifers do is that we're very strong about the idea that science demonstrates the humanity of the unborn, but oftentimes we miss that there's an additional component to that, and there's a philosophical component to that. So what we'll do is, I see people who are very confident in the science part, and they say the unborn are human, so it's wrong to kill them. So I try to help people make distinctions early on. I like to think of conversations as like the game of Risk. I don't know if anybody's ever played that board game Risk, but it's almost silly in Risk to go crazy and try to take over too many countries, because every country I take over, I now have to defend. And so the first thing to logically work through a conversation well is to limit what I'm trying to tackle, right? First, I'm going to tackle the moral nature of abortion. Then I'll tackle the legal nature of abortion. And I'll try to separate those two conversationally. I'm not going to try to convince you that it needs to be illegal first. I'm just going to try to convince you that it's wrong first. And let's start there. And so as I work my way through that, I try to make a case that we have to focus on the question, what is the unborn? Because that shuts off things like when justifications that people will give where they say, like, if we're going to, what are we going to do with all these poor kids that are born? So I tell people, ask yourself, whatever justification they offer, would they offer that justification for killing a 2-year-old child? And if the answer is no, then what they're doing is they're not arguing for abortion. They're assuming that the unborn are the kind of thing we're allowed to kill. And they're not allowed to do that. Just like I'm not allowed to assume the unborn are the kind of thing we have to protect. I have to argue my position. They have to argue theirs. If they wouldn't kill 2-year-olds to reduce poverty, if they wouldn't kill 10-year-olds to reduce poverty, then if the unborn are like us, then we don't kill them to reduce poverty as well, right? And then I get to making my case. And I make my case through the application of science and philosophy. I watch you a lot, by the way. So I love watching you when you do
I can't stand when I know you guys are watching, like you and Josh Brahm. I'm like, please, I hope none of the apologists are watching me right now.
Oh, I watch you all the time. I love watching people, especially in front of the audiences where you talk. And I think you do a fantastic job, by the way, of doing one thing. You control your emotions very well. People come at you very hot and very angry. And I feel like you do a really good job of not letting them dictate the emotion of the conversation, of bringing them back. And then people say crazy things, and I see people say crazy things to you. You do a good job at graciously answering them, giving them the best version of the argument that they're trying to make, right? And so that's an important skill to do, because when we're talking about the science, and the science is distinctive at this point. I mean, it is, at this point, it's a done thing, right? I mean, when I tell people, look, the unborn from the moment of fertilization are whole and distinct human life. They're whole. They're not a part of anything else. They're distinct. They're different from any cell in the body of their mother and their father, and they're life. They're a living thing. And nobody is arguing against this. One of the greatest tools that we've been given in the last year in our belt to have that discussion, I think was offered by Steve Jacobs, who is at Illinois Right to Life right now. He just finished his PhD thesis last year at University of Chicago. So not some small university out there, like one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And as part of his PhD thesis, he asked thousands of academic biologists at the highest level when a mammal's life begins. And of the 5,500 responses he got, 96% of them affirmed that the life begins at fertilization. And that's in Maureen Kondik, in her book Human Embryos and Human Beings, Dr. Kondik says, look, we know that at the sperm's life comes to an end and the egg's life comes to an end as part of the father and the mother, and we have a new cell. And that new cell we must define and understand as nature. And from the moment it comes into existence, it's acting self-directive, self-protective, self-organized. It is the beginning of a new human life from the moment it comes into existence. And there really is no good argument against that. So all the discussions about what's morally happening to this life have to be had in the context of what we're doing to a human life. So they have to answer the question, why are we allowed to do this to that human life, what we would never accept you to do to a more mature human life? Because that's the difference. It's a question of maturity. And it's hard for us to look at that.
Well, it's about their life experiences, Jay. It's about your life experiences. How do you answer that when someone says, well, your life is really your collection of life experiences and your capacity to have thoughts and emotions?
Yeah, that's one that opens up a bad door for them, right? Because it depends on what they mean about psychological continuity. First of all, rational capacities, psychological continuity, these are things we have no idea how to clearly define. So they're ill-defined concepts to begin with, right? And we know, though, that newborns don't have any meaningful psychological life like that. They're not rational. They're not experiencing things any more than they were inside their mother's body, which they were experiencing things at that same level. I mean, my son Peyton, when my wife was pregnant with him, he would push against parts of the body from the inside. I could see his hand push out, and I would push back and he would move his hands to different parts, right? So he is experiencing his world. His experiences are just at that maturity level different, but it didn't change when he was born. And so when they give an ill-defined concept like psychological capacities or rational capacities, they leave human life from early on very vulnerable to abuse. And that goes against our natural instincts to believe that the earliest life that we see, babies, toddlers, these small lives, they need to be protected and cherished in a special way. But that argument that you just gave, that leaves them open to abuse. That leaves them open to being defined out of the family of valuable human life, which they have been by certain philosophers that have said there's nothing morally wrong with killing a newborn. Well, I think the overwhelming majority of people would say there is something morally wrong with killing a newborn. That's called infanticide. And there's something deeply wrong with that. As long as our moral intuitions are still working there, we should recognize that without any measurable understanding about what we mean about human experiences, right? I was debating this guy in a college campus. He was actually a faculty member. And he said that. He said, it is my psychological experiences with other human beings that make me a part of the human story. So I asked, when did that begin? And he said, well, it's not really important to me to answer when it begins. So, well, of course it's not important to you. No one's going to kill you. The question for those people is, it is very important for the unborn for us to be able to define when it begins, because you're justifying killing them based on something that you can't even give me a clear understanding of when it begins. So the poorly defined nature of it just leaves way too many human beings that most of us will uncontroversially accept as part of our human family open to abuse and outright killing.
Yeah, that's great. I wish I would have said that to the last student who asked me that on the campus. I wish I had a little Jay Watts earbud in my ear. Someone's been posted a question on this Facebook Live, and you guys can actually, I forgot to mention, I'm sorry, you can be asking us questions and I will see them. We did get a question. I've gotten pushback with the "it's my privacy right" and don't know where to go after the "it's my right" discussion begins. How would you answer that?
Well, I'd have to ask more questions. Let's split that answer in two, right? Because if they're just saying, which is what Roe v. Wade and Doe versus Bolton said, right, that privacy is the justification for abortion, they might be making that error that I mentioned earlier, which is assuming the unborn are the kind of thing that we're allowed to kill without actually arguing for it. When this happens a lot for me on college campuses, and I'll ask, the first time it happened was at a school out in California. I had this faculty member say, well, women's right to privacy, we have to protect women's right to privacy. So I asked, I've used a tool that we call Trot Out the Toddler that I learned from my former boss and forever mentor, Scott Klusendorf, where I said, okay, and I take your objection very seriously, right? Privacy is very important to me. I'm a deeply introverted guy. And I said, but let me ask you a question. I put my hand on my hip and I said, imagine I have a 2-year-old little girl standing next to me. And every night in the privacy of their own home, her father viciously abuses this little girl. would it be okay with you if we violated the privacy of this family, empowered the state to go into that house through Child Protective Services and take that child out to protect her from that abuse? And of course, he said, of course, immediately. So then I asked the question, why? Why is that okay? And he said, what do you mean why? And I said, well, it's a private matter. It's a matter of privacy. It's happening in the privacy of their own home. And he said, well, it's different. I said, well, why is it different? And so he kept trying to get out of it. I kept pushing. No. I need to understand why you're allowed to violate the privacy of that family to take that child out. And so finally, after much frustration, I put him on the spot. And he said, privacy is not a justification for the abuse of other human beings. I agree with you. So if the unborn are human in the same way that that little girl is, then as important as we both recognize that privacy is, we also both recognize it has reasonable limits. And you, sir, define those reasonable limits as when another human being is being hurt or abused. So the question isn't privacy. The question is, what are the unborn? That's where we differ, because we both value privacy. But they could just mean from that something different altogether. They could be talking about something more like bodily autonomy rights, right? I have the right to do with my body whatever I want to do without the interference of the state. And to take that line, they actually admit that the unborn are human in the same way that you and I are, and they embrace that idea. And you pointed out, I thought correctly, that this has been an interesting time to watch people wrestle with autonomy, right? I mean, it's been because we hear on college campuses all the time about how autonomy is everything, but suddenly they're put in a position where they can recognize that they're not directly at the same risk that other people are, but it's reasonable to limit their choices and behavior based on what's happening to other people as a result of the choices that they make. And this is affecting all of their choices. And so when we come to autonomy, we say, look, autonomy is not everything. And I will say this, and if it's about bodily autonomy, if it's that I got the right to make whatever decision I want with my body, as much as I love Frank Beckwith's responses to it, and as much as I love Christopher Kaiser's responses to this, and both of them have given great responses in their books, Kate Greasley, a pro-choice legal philosopher who's working at Oxford University, in her book, Arguments About Abortion, answered this where she said, if the unborn are human, if we're granting that, then the moral and legal threshold that has to be met in order to justify killing them is too high to be met with all of the circumstances that are raised through abortion. This is a pro-choice legal philosopher who said there's no necessity and there is no proportionality. And that if they are human, if we're acknowledging the humanity of the unborn, then we have no justification that rises to the level either morally or legally to be able to make that decision, because it's not necessary that the child die. And the child trading its life for the inconvenience, however deep those inconveniences are, is not a proportional trade for the value of the life that's taken. So that's why she says, as a pro-choice person, I have to argue that the unborn are not human, because as soon as I acknowledge their humanity, I acknowledge that we don't have a legal or moral threshold that we can meet with the arguments that justify abortion. And I think that's just a devastating hammer to that autonomy argument.
It absolutely is. I love honest pro-choice people who are actually willing to say, well, no, I realize I have to be philosophically consistent here. And so they just deny science, instead. But at least they're being honest. All right. So we have a couple more questions that have come in. What do we do when people's moral intuitions no longer keep them from saying infanticide is wrong? In other words, when you say it's infanticide and the other person then says, I don't care, it's still my choice, what do you say to them then? I know what I've said to someone.
Yeah. I've actually had somebody say something like that to me. A lot of times,
bite the bullet. It's like they bite the bullet. Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly what they're doing. They're biting bullets in order to hold on to their arguments. I had a young man in California approach me one time when I got done speaking at his school, and he started the conversation. He's like, "You are so inhumane. How can you be so inhumane?" I was like, wait, what's going on here? And he said, "How can you be so inhumane as to say a woman must be forced to have her child?" I said, well, I never said. Let's go back and talk. When do you think human life becomes valuable? And he started that rational capacities argument. And then we got to the idea that he's saying it's okay to kill newborns. And there's nothing wrong with killing them morally. And so I asked him a question. I said, let me clarify this. Because he said, I just need to be consistent with my views, right? He's like, I'm just trying to be consistent with my views. And I told him, it's like, look, I appreciate that. There is no virtue in a vicious consistency, by the way. But let's go on, right? And so I said, let's imagine that I put an onion on a table And let's imagine that I put a newborn on the same table, and this newborn child has no one in the world that cares about them, no one in the world that has any relationship to them, no one that wants them to continue to live. And I take a sharp knife and I cut through that onion, and I continue across the table and I cut through that newborn child. Are you honestly telling me that you see no moral difference between those two actions? And then he said, in order to be consistent with my arguments, I have to say yes. And so I said, well, let's stop for a second. And this helps, I think, conversationally. It's good to narrate things. And what I mean by narrate is occasionally we need to go back, whether in writing or in this form, and say, I want to understand what you said so I don't straw man you. Let's go back and let's go over so to make sure I am accurately interacting with your views. And I said, so I went through everything that we said. And I said, now let's go. The conversation started. He put his hands up and he said, I started this conversation up with calling you inhumane. And I just said there's no difference between cutting up an onion and cutting up a newborn. And I was like, yeah, that's where we are. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that's where we were. And he said, yeah, I do. And he got very upset and he started walking. I said, man, I don't want this to become a bad thing, right? This is supposed to be a safe conversation between the two of us about a place where we disagree. And he said, no, I just realized I have a lot of very strong opinions, but I don't have a lot of really good arguments to support him. So I need to go away and think about that for a while. And that was a very honest guy, right? So that's the best you're going to get. The other thing that you can do at that point is to draw those conclusions out for them in front of whatever audience is watching, because it's not always that person you're going to win over. But when you have a number of people listening and that they realize the lengths to which they're going to go to defend that view, to where suddenly they're saying, well, to be consistent, let's kill newborns. There's nothing wrong with that. And they will, I've had people come up to me and they say, I was on the fence, but that guy convinced me abortion was wrong, right? That view was too stark for me. And so I found myself gravitating towards you as I watched the conversation go, which is a great reminder for us to keep our cool, even when somebody's being completely unreasonable in front of us, because we're capable of using them to speak to others through this conversation.
Mm-hmm. That's great. No, I think that's so important too. It's you've got to know your audience, and I think that's why when we're online, we have an incredible opportunity, because not only are you having that discussion with that friend or family member, but everyone else is reading what you're writing in the comments. That's why your behavior is really important, not to get sucked into the name calling or whatever, what level they've gotten to on your Facebook page. Okay, so there's another question that came in. And don't forget, you all can ask some questions and I will see them. All right. So a 17-year-old was raped, but did not realize she was pregnant until too late for an abortion. So she went through with the pregnancy, but her baby was born with trisomy and only lived, must have been, maybe she's saying trisomy 18, and only lived 3 hours. My daughter argues that this is why we need abortion. How do I answer her?
Well, one thing is to acknowledge, I have a lot of conversations with people where they see abortion as a means of avoiding suffering, right? And so as we recognize that any system that we're discussing, any ethical system is going to have its hard questions. Mm-hmm. And for us, these are our hard questions in the sense that this is the place where our devotion to human life comes into conflict with what other people may see as an easier path. And one thing I can say as I talk to people is that there is no way to avoid suffering. But in this particular case, would it have been a better choice for us to aggressively attack our children before they're born rather than to let them to manage their care, right? I mean, this is exactly why we have hospice care in the United States, both at that level and at the end of life after people have lived a long life, is because we recognize that there are times where we are fighting a losing battle at keeping someone alive. And so we transition into doing everything that we can to create an environment that honors life, that honors the person in front of us. So there's no easy answer where we can sit here and say a knockdown answer. Okay, yeah, well, here's the truth of it, and this makes it okay. That's a terrible thing. Nobody wants to endure that. Nobody anywhere wants to go through that. But the principle that says that we can't attack innocent life, that we're not justified in killing it, says that we can't attack them simply because they are suffering from something that will fail to let them thrive or flourish in this world, and that they face even an early departure. So what is the most human response to that we have? And I ask people conversationally, is the most human response that we have to authorize the destruction of our unborn child because we foresee a period of suffering that we know will end at a certain time? Or can we do all that we can to love that life and to create an environment where everyone, including the family that's grieving, where there's a deep grieving process that goes on here when you realize that your child won't be all the things that you wanted them to be, or their future isn't going to be what you wanted it to be. The pro-life position doesn't deny any of that. What it does is it asks the question, what is the most human response that we have to what we would call the natural evil that we're being confronted? And for me, the most human response that we have is not to license the killing of our offspring before they're born, but as a community to find a way to walk beside these people and to do a better way of rallying around them so that this is a restorative and community building experience and not an isolating tragedy that leaves them on their own, mourning the life of a child that maybe most of us never even knew was there.
How do you answer? I love that. I mean, I think suffering, before I move on to the next question, suffering is probably the number one thing when people come up to me, students come up to me on campus who are upset with me or pro-abortion. Their questions ultimately always, one, it always comes down to what is it, right? They fundamentally deny the human nature of the preborn child. But then it's always around suffering. And it's almost as if suffering itself has become, in a world where there's no objective moral right or wrong, suffering has become an objective wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
Because what you just said is right, because what they understand themselves as are these fully autonomous beings living this life where the whole purposes of this life is for them to enjoy whatever moment that they have here at this time as fully and as maximally as they can. And they don't see themselves oftentimes as members of a greater community. Marianne Glendon writes about this in her book, Rights Talk, Harvard professor. She talks about the idea of that they appeal to rights to get what they want from the community without always seeing clearly that the same thing that gives them rights also gives them or puts upon them duties and responsibilities to other people and to the community. And we too often want the rights without the duty and the responsibility. And we have an obligation to others to not kill them, basically, is the first most obvious. And I do think we need to break those people down into two, right? When the people come up to us or you have conversations, a lot of times there is personal suffering that they're trying to deal with. And for that conversation, we need to be very sensitive. Other times you see people that are doing this hypothetical practice of trying to imagine the worst possible scenario they can ever put another human being in and say, wouldn't it be better for that person to be dead than to be alive? And there, I told, look, this is kind of a macabre game. Can we dial it back to realistic scenarios where we're dealing with the actual things that human beings have to deal with, instead of just searching as best we can to try to make up a scenario where you're finally justified in killing another human being? Because here's the thing. None of those fantastic or we talked about this, these hard cases that represent a very small percentage of the number of abortions that happen in our country. None of these extreme cases justify abortion as it's happening every day in the United States. They're not talking about the 96, 99% of abortions that are happening. They're trying to lock in on one or two tiny fractional amounts of what's going on in this country and saying because that happens, we should all be able to get abortion for any reason whatsoever. Well, that doesn't hold. Those don't justify that. And you can call them on their bluff when they're playing that game. When it's not personal, when it's not somebody dealing with tragedy, I call them on that bluff. I say, okay, so if I were willing to fight for, or if I were willing to give in on that for the moment, if I were willing to concede that for the moment, would you join me then in fighting against the 98% of abortions that happen in this country that have absolutely nothing to do with what you're talking about right now? And they're like, well, no, of course not. I'm like, well, why not? You brought it up. I thought that was the reason that you thought women needed access to abortion. And we don't make laws from those extreme cases, right? We don't craft law from the extremes. Just because every once in a while I may be justified in running a red light because of an emergency doesn't mean we should get rid of all light signals out there, because that would be chaos and dangerous to everybody. It just means now we have to find out what the moral thing to do is in this extreme, as opposed to what it is to do under normal circumstances.
That's right on. That's absolutely right. What about the question we get, and you have heard this, I'm sure, speaking on campuses, you're a man, just shut up about abortion. You have no right to talk about abortion. How do you tell other young men how to respond to that argument that they're going to obviously hear if they're pro-life?
Yeah, we hear that a lot too, is when you go speak like all girl Catholic high schools in the Northeast, or even out west like San Francisco.
You sound like you've had a personal experience.
Yeah, they love that question, man. And it is it's funny because they ask in a lot of different ways, but basically it's like, what gives you the right to talk about this? And what I tell them is that the case that I make is a moral case. It's a moral case if the unborn are human, which science says that they are, and if abortion is the unjust destruction of innocent human life, because I believe that all humans are valuable by virtue of what they are, not what they can do. So we should treat every human being with dignity and respect. Then the unjust destruction of an innocent human life is a moral case, not a gender case. It has nothing to do with my sex. The arguments that I use, either the science or the philosophy that I use, they're either sound or unsound. They're valid or invalid, right? They're right or wrong. They're propositional statements that are true or false, but they're not male or female. And so it's called an ad hominem attack. You're attacking me. And I tell audiences all the time, like, look, if you just absolutely insist, I'll get some of my friends to come back and say the exact same things to you that I just said to you. But rather than adding this ridiculous hurdle to a moral conversation, let's just acknowledge that the destruction of other human beings is all of our business. And if you want to justify it, you're going to have to justify it using science and philosophy. And if I want to defend the idea that it's wrong, I'm going to have to do so the same way. But I can't attack you personally. Just like you can't just say, Jay's a jerk, so he's wrong. Well, I can be a jerk and still be right. Both of those things can be true. Just like I can be a man and still be right. And then I further add, for all of you men out there, this is where I'll get a little bit more on my, the Supreme Court case that decided the legality of it was decided by 7 men against 2 men. The Supreme Court cases that continue to protect the legality of it are often decided by men voting, and the deciding vote for years was Justice Kennedy, a man. Some of the greatest legal minds out there that have defended it for the last 50 years, some of them passed and some of them still alive, have been men. Some of the greatest philosophers, David Boonin, his book, A Defense of Abortion, to me, is one of the great pro-choice books out there. If you're going to read to get a handle on how they argue and what they believe, he's a man. Your problem is not with men having an opinion on this. Your problem is with men having an opinion differing from yours on this. So you don't get to pick and choose when men get to be involved in this. First of all, I'm not asking your permission. I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. That's been a fascinating thing with people now telling me I don't have the right to talk about it. It's like last time I checked, I was in the United States of America. I have the right to defend the moral positions that I want to defend, and I don't need to ask your permission to do so. So I'll keep talking whether you like it or not. But I'm not wrong because I'm a man, because none of the arguments that I have made have been predicated on my maleness. They've been predicated on things that you can take on the science, take on the philosophy, take them on their merits, not on who's arguing it, because that is one of the first and most fundamental mistakes people can make logically. And men have the right to talk about this because we're talking about the value of all human life, male and female out there. And so you have a stake in this game. So we shouldn't be silenced, and we shouldn't kowtow to people who say, be quiet on this. We should be brave and courageous and stand right back up and say, until you have a better argument for why you're allowed to kill them, then I will keep talking. And you're going to do nothing to make me quiet about this, because this is an issue of such moral importance that I think silence itself is wrong.
Well, this is why everyone has just seen Why I Love Jay Watts. There you go. All right. So I have a couple of questions, 2 more questions for you, I think. This one's kind of a funny question. But I think it's not beyond the realm of what you'll get.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if aliens came to Earth, would you defend alien fetuses? Baby Yoda.
Yeah. I've actually gotten that question several times from people. What I think is weird about it, when I point out to them, is what's strange to me is that you think me, the person that has an inclusive view of value and doesn't want anyone to be killed and doesn't want you to intentionally kill other beings, human beings that have certain capacities, would want to kill aliens. It seems much more likely to me that you, who are so comfortable sectioning out different people and say it's okay to kill this human life and not them, are the one that has to answer that question. Because obviously, if I had some rational alien, some moral alien, where we had a shared understanding of objective moral values and could sit down and talk about these things, I don't just go around killing everything that's not human, folks. I mean, it's not like I've restricted my love for life to just human beings. What we've argued is that there's something particularly and especially wrong with killing other human beings. And so in that sense, when people bring that to me, I'm like, of course I wouldn't kill Yoda. What a weird question, right? I'm the guy that doesn't like killing things. You're the one that thinks that we should be free to kill. So for me, sure, absolutely. I'm not killing Yoda. I'm not killing aliens. I will include them in the entire family of things that I treat with dignity and respect. When they show up, when the Vulcans show up and we have a conversation, we're all on the same page. We don't kill each other. And I think it's odd that would be thrown back on me, because the people who are justifying killing are the other side, it's the pro-choice side. So that question is better asked in your direction, not mine. I don't want to kill people.
Thank you for answering that. So I had that question. I was thinking about, April. There's always Earth Day in April. And we get this question a lot on campuses. Well, the environment would thrive. The world would thrive if we had more abortions and less born human beings. Human beings are destroying Mother Earth. Therefore, we need abortion. How do you answer that question?
Here's my succinct answer to that. I think you have a terrible view of human beings when you look at the world that way. Your worldview is fundamentally flawed. And if you're looking at the human family through that lens, then I can understand why you support abortion. But I ask people to consider that human beings aren't problems by nature. In fact, we're problem solvers by nature. Mm-hmm. When you get enough of us working on a problem, we come up with great solutions. And a lot of the things that people tell me that they're afraid about are things that we already have good solutions for. They're just decades behind on research. They're not aware that we've already fixed a lot of this. And they see all of humanity as this great problem to be solved, as opposed to this idea of the human experience and our interaction with nature is a problem we're capable of solving together. And that human beings working, the more of us you put on a problem, the faster we get to it. I used to point to World War II as an interesting subject matter as far as how you saw the total war effort in the United States. But I think you're seeing it right now in a very interesting way, right? Mm-hmm. When I have made no secret of my love for Dyson vacuum cleaners. I think Dyson vacuum cleaners are like the greatest thing in the world. And I've got two of them because one of them stopped operating. And I got a small house and I've got two vacuum cleaners because one of them, when it wasn't operating as well as we liked, my wife was gracious enough to buy me another one just so that I'd be happy, right? And so Dyson goes and says, look, I'm making ventilators now. That's what we're doing during this process. We're going to start making ventilators, and we're going to find a way to make them more efficiently. You have all of a sudden the medical community that's coming together and in real time sharing what's going on from patient to patient, right? So we're shortening that gap of information to almost immediate. Right? If I did something that worked here and then they share it online almost immediately, the ability that we have to take on problems and solve them is just utterly astonishing. And so that's why I say that we're not problems by nature, we're problem solvers. I will say one thing I think is funny. I have seen online a lot of people saying, well, look at all these things that are happening. Like one, they're like, in Venice, the canals are clear. Okay, the canals weren't nasty because they were polluted. There's just sand on the bottom of them, and a lot of traffic lifts the sand up. The sand settled on the bottom. You can see it, right? They're like the monkeys are in the streets in these different countries. Like, yeah, they are because they're starving and aggressive and they're attacking people. That's not a good thing. I mean, I don't see you celebrating that the rats are taking over the streets of New Orleans, right? I mean, there's a tendency to remove human beings from nature as if everything else in humanity was nature and we were these monsters that live amongst us. And that's ridiculous. We're a part of it all. And we're a part of the solution for it all when we work that way. And we're capable of making better choices. So it's not necessary to take some grim view of life where every human being is some awful thing. If that's how you feel, your problem isn't that I'm arguing against abortion. Your problem is that you need to reevaluate how you view other human beings and spend some time valuing things like the hug of your child or just company with somebody that you love, and just sitting down with other human beings and realizing they can be pretty great too.
Thank you. That's perfect. I think we hear that all the time, and it's starting from this assumption that human beings are bad.
Yeah, like we're bad. Alone in all the natural order. We're the only bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you handle? I told you this is the last question. I lied. How do you handle the question when you're talking with an atheist, agnostic, who says, well, I get why you're saying that because you're a Christian and you believe you were made in the image of some deity that's been made up. But we're the same as any other creature. There's no difference between us. And usually then I try to point out like they're obvious hypocrites because, they're a mass murder of bugs and, are cockroaches the same. But I have them, how do you kind of handle the discussion about how and why human beings are fundamentally different than a cockroach? And how do you do that to someone who's not a practicing Christian or a believer in a creator?
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the first questions that I mentioned that I ask people is, would it be objectively wrong if we kill each other? 2 or 3 times since I've asked that question to people conversationally, I've had people say no, and they base it on that entire thing. They said that I don't believe in the existence of objective moral values. I don't believe in right and wrong. I believe that society sets certain rules and that all the rights and value that you have is generated by this sort of social contract theory or utilitarianism or anything like that. And so what I caution people on that point is it's probably not the greatest idea to keep arguing with that person that abortion is wrong or should be illegal, because they don't think killing anybody is really wrong. So now you have to take a step back and have a worldview discussion with them. And how do they fit into the worldview that they're describing, the moral intuitions that we have? So many things are obviously wrong. And some of those that we talk about, like genocide or rape, is obviously wrong. I don't know anybody that when you talk to them conversationally, do you say that rape is okay? I remember talking to a young man out in San Francisco, and I just kept asking him questions. What do you think about raping a woman? Is raping a woman wrong, objectively wrong? And he'd say, well, I don't think it's right, but how am I to tell other people what they can and can't do? Like, well, what a morally vacuous answer, right? If there's something we can agree on, it should be that raping a woman is wrong. Say, well, how about genocide, right? The intentional destruction of a people group because they occupy some land that you want or because you hate them for some racially motivated reason. Is that wrong? And he would say, well, I don't think it's a good idea, but I can't tell other people what they can and can't do. Like, well, yeah, actually you can. And I kept asking all these questions. And what was interesting was that he had the exact same moral intuitions that I had, but he just had to add that caveat to everything. And when I asked him why that was, I said, why is it that in every question that I ask you, is that wrong? You answer, you think it's personally wrong, but you refuse to universalize it. And he said, well, the reason we agree is because we were raised in the same culture. I said, well, no, actually, I don't think we were, right? And I didn't mean that flippantly. I was like, you live in San Francisco. I lived in Georgia. Those are not the same culture at all. The reason that we agree, and you'll find agreement on these things broadly shared throughout the human experience, is because they're wrong. And the reason that you refuse to make that step is because you view objective morality as something troublesome to a greater worldview that you have. Now, not all atheists agree with you, by the way. There are a lot of atheists that agree objective moral values exist and are very comfortable condemning people. Sam Harris would be one of those. Michael Martin would be one of those. These were people that have no problem whatsoever in saying that objective moral values exist absent from God, and so we have to determine the right and wrong nature of behaviors. It's not necessarily true. Now, I believe as a Christian that they don't have good grounding for objective moral values, but I was once an atheist, and I was once on the other side of this, so I understand where they're coming from and what they think. But as I point out to those moral intuitions to them, I just keep asking that question, why do you think you share the same moral intuitions about all these things that I do and all of these theists do? Is it because we're all mistaken in the same way that we believe these things to be wrong? Or is it possible that it just is true that it's objectively wrong to rape a woman, to perform genocide, and that we have responsibilities, obligations, and duties to other human beings that transcend our cultures and our lives as human beings. So you just have to be open to the idea that a conversation victory isn't always, I agree with everything you said and I'm changing my mind. Sometimes you have to be comfortable with the idea. And for me, what ultimate victory looks like is when somebody looks at me and says, I never thought about it like that. I need to go away and think about this some more. Because when I changed my mind about all this, it took a long time. It took years of very good arguments. And some of the people that I talked to that were responsible for changing my mind, if you told them, they'd be like, no way, he was such a jerk when I was talking to him. I was rude, I was abusive, I was all of those things when I would have conversations about stuff like this from the other side. And that's why it's so important to me now to be the kind of person that made way for me, that opened up for me the ability to see that I was wrong and opened up a path for me to change my mind, because I know what worked and what didn't. And I know the people that reached me and that didn't. And so being gentle in that conversation and pointing out to them the failure of their worldview to account for so many things that we just commonly experience as human beings is something that they should deeply consider. And then we can get back to abortion later.
What made you change your mind? You said you were an atheist, and were you pro-choice as well?
No, yeah.
What made you change your mind?
On the atheism thing, it was actually the moral argument was one of the things. There were two major things, but one of them was the argument, because I was hardcore nihilistic in that sense, and I was like, oh no, there's no such thing as objective morality. And part of the reason I was that because I saw the world like the world's just a terrible, awful place. Like I used to be like that, right? The world is just a terrible, awful place, and everybody in it is awful. But then I had to ask myself a question: why does it bother me? You know, if that's just the way that it is, why does it bother me? Why do I have a continual sense that it shouldn't be this way? That not that human beings aren't awful. I agree. Still to this day, I think most of us treat each other terribly. But why does it bother me? Because if I was right then, that's just the way the world should have been. But underlying all of it was a sense that this was wrong, a judgment upon it, and that really sort of eroded at my atheism to the point that I began to consider other views. And through a long research, I ended up where I am today as a Christian. But it was as a Christian, I knew immediately that I was going to have to reevaluate things. Actually, weirdly enough, one of the first things that I ever prayed as a Christian to God was, look, I hadn't believed in you my whole life. I didn't know you were there. I don't know what following you means. I don't know what living a life like this means. But so I'm not going to make a lot of demands on you. I'll just do whatever you want me to do. But one of the things I would prefer, if you're taking requests, is that I never, ever have to talk about abortion again for the rest of my life, because it was just a horrible, awful conversation that I didn't want to be involved in. But a lot of the arguments that I make when I stand up in front of audiences are the arguments that began to wear on me during my time over that first few years as a Christian. And there came a moment where I was convinced, but not active. I was convinced to the point, but I had no activity to it. And the story of how that became active is just too long to go into. But I see those as two distinct different things. One of them was I became convinced of the humanity of the unborn. And then in another step, I suddenly became convinced that silence in the face of this is wrong, and that to remain silent would put me in the company of people that I've studied all throughout history, that I've looked back and said, how could you have lived during that time while that was going on, and said nothing? And so I woke up one day and said, well, I'm going to have to figure out a way to say something on this, because if they are what I believe they are, what the best arguments tell me they are, just like us, and if I owe every human being out there dignity and respect, then I got to find some way to talk about this now.
Yeah. And thank you. I'm so glad that you had the courage to do that. How can folks who are listening follow you and get more information and learn more about JSpeak? I took some notes while you were talking myself. So where can everyone follow you at?
Look, you go to our website is merelyhumanministries.org. I am on Facebook as both as Jay Watts and as Merely Human Ministries I have other people working with me on the ministry in the background or writing articles in the blog. We have a blog. I'm doing videos. Now that we're transitioning internally, I'm going to be putting out a lot more podcasts and a lot more short videos. Because I had a videographer, but now he is isolated somewhere. So I had to go get all my equipment from him and wipe it all down and learn how to use it. And so tomorrow, I think I'm taking my first run at short videos and things like that. Okay. So we're trying to build resources there at the website, on Instagram, on Facebook, and anybody can ask me anything through our website. If you go there and it's merelyhumanministries.org, there is a way to ask questions. And if you ask a question, I get it. I mean, the web guy sends them to me. He doesn't try to answer them. He's like, here you go. Here's a question for you.
Do you have a podcast that's on Apple Podcasts?
Not yet. Right now, we're on SoundCloud. We're going to get it on Apple. It's one of the things we're going to be working on over the next couple of weeks is getting it in a wider distribution. But you can listen to it in your browser on SoundCloud through our website.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, when you were talking about suffering, I was like, wait a minute. I think my podcast on suffering is supposed to go up tonight. So I checked my podcast. I was like, we recorded it not long ago, but I was like, oh my goodness, I think we have a podcast on this. But this is a question that it comes up all the time. But Jay, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us tonight. And you look like you're in your dad comfy chair. So thanks for hanging out with us.
We were trying to find a really cool place to shoot from. And so my family's in there getting a room ready. And when we did the test run earlier, he's like, you look great. Stay there. So I had to yell to the other rooms like, stop cleaning. It's fine. They're like, you're seeing me in my office here. But
it's ProLife Dad.
Yes. It was so much fun. Thank you for letting me come on.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who tuned in tonight. Hopefully we helped kind of get you started, gave you some kind of tips for how you can have conversations and see it's not as hard as you think it is. Yeah. You can have conversations online. And when you get stuck, you can contact Jay Watts and ask Jay how to get yourself out of, if you're in a box or feel like you're in a corner, how can you kind of turn that conversation around? I think the biggest tip we heard at the end of the evening tonight that you should remember is redefine what you believe is a win. Yes. A win is not going to be someone who comes up to me saying, you are absolutely right. I've been absolutely wrong. I'm changing my mind, whether that's an in-person conversation or it's an online conversation. A win is going to be when someone says, I've never thought about this way. I need to think about that. Or when someone who maybe didn't really like pro-lifers or have a very good view of the pro-life brand who said, wow, I never knew pro-lifers had this opinion and had this all thought out before. Yeah. So you have to I think you need to redefine what your win is. I always look at it as planting seeds of truth. You don't know. You might be able to have a conversation with someone and you might be kind of harvesting another seed that someone else planted years ago. But maybe that one thing you said is kind of that final light bulb, but you never know. And that's why you always have to continue to speak truth. So make sure you check out Merely Human Ministries. Continue to follow Jay Watts and make sure you tune in next week. Liz Wheeler from One America will be joining me, and we're going to be talking about countering abortion culture. And if you all know Liz, you know it's going to be fun. Bye, guys.